Sailors, what's the most unusual thing you've experienced while at sea? We were sailing 330th ship from the North Sea to West Africa. I was off shift and sleeping. I woke up and for some reason decided to go up to the bridge, which is something I usually never did when I could be sleeping or eating. It was night, so all the lights were off on the bridge, save for a few red ones, and I noticed how bright it was outside. I went over to starboard, and the ducking white cliffs of Dover were completely illuminated by a full moon, just beaming moonlight. It was one of the most amazing things I've ever seen. Of course, the mate on duty was English and was nonchalantly like, "Yeah, that's Dover." This one isn't me, but a Welsh guy I met in the Caribbean. He had done a few transatlantic trips in a small sailboat, so had tons of ocean experience. A big storm caught him, with huge rolling waves. He decided to heave to ride it out, basically using your sail and the rudder to put the brakes on and give yourself a smoother ride. He was in the cockpit and was riding up one of the bigger waves. The next part is wild. He swears that a giant whale just below the surface cruised up the wave beside him and just stared straight at him. He describes looking into this animal's huge eyeball, just looking back at him for what was probably a couple seconds, but he said felt like minutes from a few feet away. He's never lied or really even exaggerated otherwise, so I believe him. Can you imagine seeing that? Sometimes I really miss being at sea. Story 2. French Navy navigator here. A few years back, went underway from Toulon on a high-sea patrol ship for a routine patrol. The sea was very rough out of the roadstead coming from the west, which was completely contradictory with what our weather briefs were indicating. Captain decided to go ahead nonetheless. We took a heading towards the east to enter Hyères Bay. When we entered in the pass, crap went down. I was outside starboard wing of the bridge to take bearings when the ship took a 35 degrees list on starboard. If I had held my arm out, it would have been underwater. I held on the compass for dear life because going overboard in that weather would have probably meant death. Needless to say, I shat myself. When the ship leveled, my boss went out to check if I was still there and ordered me to go below to check how bad the damage was to some of our gear. I went, and when I was at the main deck, the ship took a 43 degrees list to starboard. I was then blessed with the horrific sight of a washing machine that was strapped in a room by the hull on port side punch a hole through the bulkhead and go straight to starboard without touching the deck. Also, a lot of the firefighting equipment, axes, hoses, pumps, was just flying all over the place, with guys from the security department desperately trying to catch it and fasten it. At that point, we had entered the bay and had better weather. We had lost electricity in the bridge and CIC, so the captain decided to wait in the bay for the weather to calm down. When it did the next day, we pulled back into port for repairs. This little escapade resulted in a few bruises, the electrical network of the bridge, and CIC being badly damaged. The guys that were supposed to strap down crap didn't do it correctly and got punished. And for me, a reminder of my mortality. On a more positive note, I once saw a stork land on our 100mm turret after a sandstorm off Libya and stay there for several hours. Also, we had a couple of sperm whales with a calf swimming alongside for almost a day off Ivory Coast. When you see that kind of stuff, it doesn't matter if you are 3 months in or 20 years in. You feel like a kid again. Story 3 was sailing off the coast of the big island Hawaii in February. We were mostly interested in fishing since the wind had died down. There were no other boats around that were visible, and it was a very calm and peaceful day. Now, often you'll see humpback whales breaching in Feb, and you can also hear them singing if you are underwater. That is cool enough. But this encounter was awesome. I was baiting a hook, and suddenly on the starboard side of the boat, a pod of about 20 melonhead whales comes up right beside the boat, and they just start staring us down. I lean over, and this one dude moves a little closer and just keeps moving his head so he can eye me up and down. They all just kept staring at us with an expression of, "Are these? Who interesting? Don't look like they can swim at all." They eyed us at close quarters for about 5 minutes and then just took off. The weirdest part of the encounter was the close eye contact I had with the first whale was definitely two individuals sizing each other up. Best part of the whole day. Story 4. My area occasionally gets phytoplankton blooms. If you're boating at night and sail into a bloom, the wake of your boat will suddenly start glowing blue. It's pretty darn bright, easily seen with the naked eye, and appears out of nowhere. 1 minute you're sailing in complete darkness, the next you're in glowing water. Story 5. I was on a run between California and Hawaii, and I was out on deck doing rounds on deck equipment, checking oil levels, etc. I saw one of those free-fall lifeboats just hanging out in the distance and was like, WTF. I called the bridge. They said a ship accidentally dropped their lifeboat a few years ago, and now it turns up from time to time. Was glad to know no one was on it, but it gave me a brief scare. Story 6. Was gently sailing down the northeast coast of New Zealand, heading into Auckland at about 2-3 a.m. I was on watch, and the other crew member was asleep below. It was a pitch black night, no moon, and the sea was very still, so as soon as you look overboard, all you saw was black. Eventually, you saw stars, but it was impossible to distinguish sea from sky. As I was keeping a watch, I saw what I thought was a shooting star, just much bigger. It came again and again until there were about 30 of these shining, glittering trails shooting around the boat. It was very disconcerting, and it took me a few minutes to click what was happening. We had sailed into a patch of luminescence, while dolphins were swimming around the boat, planing on both it and our wake. I had not noticed them due to it being so dark. For something so simple, it was a very moving, almost spiritual experience, and it will remain one of my all-time, most fondest memories. Story 7. Not a sailor, but a lifelong surfer, so I've spent plenty of time in and around the ocean. I was camping on the beach in Baja with some friends when I noticed the moon was going to be setting over the ocean in a few hours. The moon that night was just a sliver, almost like a fingernail. We had actually gotten kind of skunked wave-wise that day, and into the night the ocean was almost completely flat, like a lake flat. No wind as well, just sheet glass, not a cloud in the sky. Just when the moon lowered to the horizon, it started to glow bright orange. And just when it hit the edge of the ocean, the reflection shimmered all the way to the sand. It looked as if the moon was floating on the sea for just a few minutes. It was one of the most beautiful sights I have ever seen, far more beautiful than any sunset. Story 8. Picking up a small 28th sailboat in Egg Harbor, NJ, delivering to Havre de Grace. We get out into the ocean. Intercoastal waterway is in the ocean down most of the coast of NJ. Wind dies dead, and night is falling. We motored all the way to Cape May in the dark and actually had to veer to port twice because we were going so perfect by the charts we would have hit 2 buoys. Hit Cape May after the sun came up, but the fog was so thick we had to anchor for a couple hours because the entrance there is narrow and hazardous. Can't risk it in someone else's boat. While anchored, we hear this loud motor approaching us, but visibility is maybe 30 or 40 feet. We start blaring an air horn every 15 seconds. Suddenly, this cruiser, probably 40,000, comes through the fog right at us. Must be going 15 or 20 knots. He pulled up and veered around us with maybe 5 horns to spare. Scared the crap out of us. Got into Delaware Bay, and finally a good tailwind, and we're off. Then we look back, and the wind is the leading edge of a strong squall, heavy rain, lightning, and thunder. Water gets choppy as hell. We're probably listing over 20 degrees in this wind. Made it to the entrance to the C&D Canal just as the rain caught us. Wind is too strong to sail through the canal, so back to motoring. Motored all the way to the Susquehanna Flats, but it's getting dark. The channel through the flats is maybe 20s wide and weaves through 2 inches of water all around. No lighted channel markers, so drop anchor again till dawn. What should have been a 3-day trip with an overnight in Cape may became a 5-day trip. Story 9. Off the coast of South Africa, I worked aboard a cage diving boat. I witnessed many amazing things, but one day, a 5+ meter female white shark approached the boat. She simply hung around and observed us, showing no interest in the cage, the chum, or the bait lines. Every time she returned to the surface, my brain would temporarily refuse to accept what I was witnessing due to how enormous she was. Like, that is what? It's so big, Jesus. She was very composed and observant. It was the first time I truly understood that, despite the fact that it is entirely foreign, there is some sort of intelligence operating in that brain. Story 10. Flying fish timed a wave right and jumped out the water and threw an open hatch directly into the galley. Freeboard was like 7 meters. The chefs shat themselves. Story 11. Was in the U.S. Navy. Pretty sure we heard siren calls somewhere, northwest of the Marshall Islands. Was on the smoke deck at 3 separate occasions at night, and anyone who was out there heard what sounded like a distant scream, screech, echoing over the waves. I remember it well because it caused several man overboard scares where we'd all have to go muster to make sure those sounds weren't any of ours. Never actually saw anything, so I rationalized that it could have been some kind of animal or seabird. But that crap sounded human, but not entirely human. We joked for weeks after we left the region that Ariel, the Little Mermaid, was gonna hit us. This was 2010, but I still remember that sound like it was yesterday. The kind of sound that hits your core like a freezing wind does. Not something I'd want to hear again. Story 12. Was in the U.S. Navy on board the USS Tarawa from 2002-2006. Some unusual things I experienced were the shellback ceremony. Basically, a sailor who has never crossed the equator is considered a slimy wog, and those who have crossed the equator were considered shellbacks. It's a huge thing that usually takes all afternoon where people dress up as King Neptune and his court and induct the new guys' girls into the fraternity. It's all lighthearted and goofy now, but back in the day it crossed into hazing territory. I got to do it twice because I became a golden shellback when we crossed the international dateline. Other than that, I worked night watch generally, and standing topside in the middle of the Persian Gulf at night was one of my favorite things. The amount of stars you could see in the sky was nuts, and just listening to the water was soothing. Story 13. On a 378 Coast Guard cutter, heading north from Cabo MX to San Diego Cay in Tennessee, we crossed paths with a 45-ton swoop heading south. We exchanged pleasantries on the radio, finding out it was a man and his wife heading to Panama. About an hour later, we received a distress call from the woman, who said her husband was missing. This being discovered after she had gone below decks for a bit. Our commanding officer ordered our cutter come about, and the big steel hull creaked and heeled over tremendously in the seas as we raced back at a full bell to the sailboat's last known position. At dusk, we found the boat and its female skipper who was trying desperately to pilot in the rough seas, with the impossible emotional weight upon her shoulders that her husband was lost, probably drowned. We immediately launched a helicopter to search for the man, a high-risk, low-reward task given the weather, while simultaneously retrieving her with our small boat, leaving the sloop to founder in the heavy seas. You see, there was no hope of towing it in that weather, because although nightfall had set in, the weather had not improved in the slightest. Against odds, the helicopter found him some 10 miles away from our position by using an infrared camera, and although being tossed about in the seas, he had been wearing his PFD life preserver when he went overboard, which clearly saved him from drowning. The helo vectored our cutter to him, and we retrieved him via small boat. There was much rejoicing amongst the crew as we provided them clean clothes/shower, and the cooks fed the couple a hot meal. They had recently retired, sold their house in Orange County, and had bought the boat with the intent of exploring the world. Everything they owned was on that boat when it slipped under the waves, but at least they had their lives, for which they were grateful. A moment of pride for us was when the crew passed the hat, just before we pulled into San Diego, to drop them off on land, which offered them enough money for transportation and meals to make it to relatives. By chipping in money, everyone got to be an active participant in their rescue, not just the pilots, the coxswains, and a handful of others who fetched them from the water. So this true story serves me as a memory of what I joined the Coast Guard for some 35 years ago, to save lives at sea, one of many Coast Guard imperatives for over 200 years. And I hope the story serves you, the reader, with assurance that your tax dollars were well spent. That night, the couple were saved. Why is the story unusual? It's unusual and unlikely to be saved within hours of an accident at sea in international waters in a small sailboat. 999 times out of 1,000, there's a good chance she would not have been able to hail anyone. And although she could have set off an iPerb device, it would have been 6, 7, 8 hours before it would have been responded to and on scene with an airplane, which still would have had to vector a Coast Guard boat, or possibly a Mexican Coast Guard boat, to the scene, and that would have been just to find her, let alone her husband. We just happened to be there at the right time, place to effect a rescue. Story 14, St. Elmo's Fire. Worked on a 90-foot fishing boat one summer off the coast of British Columbia. One calm and starry night, I went on deck to have a smoke, and I saw faint greenish-blue flames coming off the very top of the radio antenna. I excitedly ran below to tell my coworkers, and they laughed at me for being such a noob. Another thing, not so unusual, but really cool to see and just slightly terrifying. I was on a rowboat that I borrowed from a neighbor, which I was using to catch rockfish off the west coast of Bowen Island. And one beautiful afternoon, I rowed out and cast my line when a full-grown orca whale swam right underneath the, now seemingly way too small, rowboat, clear as day and so close that I thought for sure its dorsal fin would capsize me. It was both terrifying and beautiful. Story 15. Back in the 90s, early 00s, I used to fish commercially for sea scallops in the Gulf of Maine. The boat I worked on was an old New England dragger, built in 1926, wood hull. It was all sorts of creaky and groany like you would expect an old wood boat to be. And when you were below deck, you could actually see the hull breathing, expanding, and contracting as it rode up and down the waves. It was pretty freaky, but also kind of cool at the same time. Anyways, we mostly did day trips, but at certain times of the season would venture further out for longer overnight trips. On more than one of those occasions, at night while down in the bunk trying to get some sleep, I would suddenly hear sharp rapping on the outside of the boat, distinctly like the sound of someone knocking on a wood door. Sometimes it was a one and done. Sometimes you'd get one or two at a time in waves throughout the night. Less often it would repeat over and over, almost methodically, moving around the boat for several minutes. It might start under your feet, then right beside your head, then switch to the other side of the boat, further down, etc., and then just suddenly stop. Aside from the fact that we were miles out at sea, the boat's draft was 6.5, and almost all of the knocking was coming from below the waterline. So there is no way it was a person doing it trying to play a prank or something. I wasn't the only one to hear it either. The captain admitted to hearing them sometimes while he was down there, and at least one of the previous owners of the boat had heard it before too. His theory was that when a scallop bed becomes too crowded, They would migrate by swimming up into the upper water column to find new areas to populate. And as we drifted through the school, or whatever you call a group of migrating scallops, their shells banging into the hull was what made the knocking sound. No idea if there is any validity to that. And I'm not convinced a sea scallop shell could knock as loudly and forcefully as the sounds we were hearing, but damned if I have any better explanation for it. Story 16. A pirate attack on a ship 5 miles behind us. This happened in Malacca Strait close to Indonesia about 15 years ago. This place was known for piracy and we had taken our safety measurements. Roll out water hoses, extra lookout, make sure all doors are locked. There was a tangible tension on the ship when all of a sudden a panicked call came on the emergency channel about small boats approaching quickly. We found the ship on our ECDs and looked back through binoculars to see the whole drama unfold. The ship had their hoses spraying water all over. The pirates were randomly shooting at the ship with machine guns. There were 3 boats. One stayed at a distance. The other 2 came in quickly and boarded. There were 2 more panicked calls from the ship, and then it went quiet. The ship changed course soon after, and I never heard what happened. Also, one time, a monsoon rain where you couldn't breathe anymore. So dense was the water. And one time in the Indian Ocean, we were surrounded by hundreds of whales for hours and hours. Most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Story 17. A rogue wave. My buddy and I were loading gear onto a weapons elevator on one of the sponsons. We supply, and we're bringing stuff to the flight deck to ship out on a cod. WEPS would let us use the elevators if they weren't using them. This was the USS Coral Sea, an ancient carrier that no longer exists. Modern ships have supply elevators, but we were at the mercy of weapons and flight ops, using a plane elevator. Anyway, it's rough seas, but nothing too major. After all, we were like 40 feet above the waterline. Anyway, we're unloading the pallet of gear onto the elevator, and something catches my eye. I look up and there is a mountain of water coming at us in slow motion. It's easily as high as the flight deck. I hit my buddy, and we both haul ass off the sponson, through the vent tunnel, and into the hangar bay. We hear and feel the wave hit the ship, and all of a sudden it's like a fire hose the size of the hatch just gushes into the hangar bay for a few seconds. So there's a cluster duck going on as lots of other stuff got messed up. But luckily, nobody was hurt. We went back out and most of our stuff was gone. Clearly, if we had been out there, we would have been swept overboard at a minimum and probably slammed around on the sponson and whatnot. Who knows if we would have been conscious enough to activate our life vests. They had a CO2 cartridge that you activated with a ripcord thing, so the vest was flat and unobtrusive unless you needed to blow it up. That was my closest call in 4 years on that ship. Not the worst trade to get free college. Oh, we also collided with an Ecuadorian oil tanker off the coast of South America. We were shooting craps, it was my birthday, and I was up about 100. Suddenly, the space just moved over 20-30 feet. Never felt anything like it. Definitely wasn't a wave. About 30 seconds later, general quarters. Later, I come to find that about 20 of the bow of the ship was bent over about 5 to 10 feet, like a tin can that just got peeled back. I got a lot of good stories out of those 4 years. Story 18. My father owned a sailboat and 36 Sons Pearson that my family spent the summers on growing up. We kept the boat in Wickford Ree and mostly spent the time going up and down the waters of New England and especially Narragansett Bay. I always remember 2 things that stand out more than anything, one of which shaped my love of space. When you're out on the water at night sailing, even just 20-50 miles off the coast, the amount of light pollution is next to nothing. The way the night sky looks when it's clear out is just phenomenal. It crushes my soul to this day how we've robbed ourselves of this amazingly breathtaking sight. The other thing was more directly related to the sea. I always remember, even at a young age, realizing just how immensely powerful the ocean is. It's downright terrifying, even when it isn't even trying to show off. Small storms can kick up incredible swells and waves. However, I think the thing that really freaked me out was the fog. When it is foggy out on the ocean, and I mean really foggy, there's just something different about the world. There was one time my father and I were sailing up to Maine. We were coming up to the inlet where we used to keep our boat when we lived there years earlier, and you couldn't even see the bow of the boat. It was so foggy. As you approach the mouth of the bay, you have to thread the boat between 2 rock reefs that have a passage between them that are just wide enough for the boat to pass between with about 5 feet of room on either side. Naturally, doing this when you can't see these reefs and have to rely on the radar screen is rather stressful, especially when you're a 14-year-old boy having to help guide your father between the reefs. Well, as we approached these reefs, I had to give my father the corrections bouncing between the radar screen and the Loran screen. When we finally got between the reefs, I felt like I was going to have a simultaneous stroke and heart attack at 14 from the stress. I will say that as much as I detested being on the boat in my teenage years, my older brother was 100% right. He said, "When this is gone, you'll miss it more than you can describe." A few months after my father passed away in 2010, I realized that I would never again get to spend time on the boat with him. I would give both my arms and legs to spend even just one day on the boat sailing around Narragansett Bay with him. Story 19. Not sure it's unusual. I worked offshore on a drill ship and experienced a couple of different things. The saddest was a shark getting stuck in the moon pool. He ended up dead. Manta rays are ducking fast. A few would just casually swim by and then, out of nowhere, just shot forward like a torpedo. Once while testing the drilling package, we had a call from Subsea for a full stop. When we checked the cameras, an octopus was climbing up the drill pipe. I ended up being lucky in having a captain that allowed fishing. Sharks loved coming behind the fish we hooked and took a bite off them. Dolphins play with each other. Whilst having a daily walk around the helideck, I heard a splash and went on full emergency mode looking for someone that fell overboard. Then another splash behind me, then another again behind me. Eventually noticed them just jumping out of the water playing. Went through the outskirts of a tornado. The eye of the storm was in China, and we were going past Taiwan, not through the strait, and still had 30-meter peak-to-peak waves. Not violent, but quite worrisome. This wasn't that far off coast. Most would be able to bobble over to shore, but the ballasting system of the drill ship ducked up and sent it swinging wildly side to side. The stability calcs had 12 degrees as the tip-over point, I believe. We were 1 or 2 from that figure. That's probably the most scared I've been. Story 20. My dad and I rarely tell this to anyone because they laugh it off, but this really happened. We were both sober, awake and alert, and nothing we can think of in our world can explain it. We were motoring into an anchorage at about 10 p.m. one night. The sea was perfectly still, and the waves gently washed against the pebble beach. That was the only sound, apart from the quiet engine noise coming from underneath the floorboards. We both had our head through the top hatches because it was quite nice weather. All of a sudden, a weird ball of cloud or mist with a faint light in it floats in from out of the night, like just materialized, hovers for long enough for both of us to see it, pauses, and then just accelerates upwards and away at about a 45-degree angle and completely disappears into the night sky. I crap you not. That was almost 7 years ago, and we both remember it exactly the same as the other. Nothing explains it. As far as I'm concerned, that wasn't something from this Earth Story 21. I wasn't there to witness it myself, as I was only 5 years old at the time, but it happened to my dad. He was a crabber in Alaska in the late 70s, early 80s. They were pretty far out in the Bering, late at night, and just terrible weather. High winds, snow dumping all around them. Just miserable conditions, hauling in pots, and that's when it happens. My dad has a massive heart attack. The captain immediately gets the Coast Guard on the horn, but the weather was just too bad for them to send out a chopper. So the captain turns the boat around and hauls ass as fast as he can to the nearest port. But it still took nearly 6 hours, so I was told anyway, as they were pretty far out and coming in heavy seas against a strong wind. Dad had more heart attacks on the way back, but luckily one of his buddies on the boat was a former military medic. He managed to keep my dad alive, and an ambulance was waiting for him when they docked. They got Dad to the hospital and got him stabilized, threw him on a life flight to Seattle, where he immediately underwent a triple bypass. He never went back out to sea after that, and years later when I was 15, Dad and I were just wandering around the Seattle Center, where the Space Needle is, and all of a sudden, we hear someone call my dad's name. We turn around and my dad calls back, "Well, hello there, Cap." And that was the day I got to meet and hug the boat captain that helped save my dad's life. Story 22. Somewhere on the Southern Atlantic 004 watch, I stepped outside on the bridge wing to have a smoke, heard a buzzing noise, looked around and up to the MEF-HF antenna, and saw St. Elmo's fire sparkling out of the top of the antenna. Unreal view, never thought to see that. Some minutes later, when I was back inside the bridge, the buzzing sound got louder, followed by a loud bang in daylight condition for 2 seconds into the middle of the night. It took me some minutes until I could see again in the darkness. When I looked outside, the only remaining part of the MEF-HF antenna was a molten bunch. A flash hit the antenna right away. Fortunately, all electric parts inside the bridge were not affected. Another time at the entrance to the English Channel, I had an elephant race with another vessel which overtook me on my port side. She sailed faster than me. Both vessels are 360 meters in length. In the middle of the night sailing through a TS, a small sailing yacht, thought it would be a good idea to cross right in front of my bow in the TS, and I tried to call them several times by VHF to warn him about the other vessel on my port side. No response. I started to reduce my speed to give them more space between us, but it takes some time to slow down a fully laden 360-meter container vessel when in full sea speed. When she crossed my bow, I could see from the bridge wing that the guys on the sailing yacht were getting a bit hectic as another huge bow appears right in front of them. They ended up between us, as there was neither enough time to cross the bow of the overtaking vessel, nor getting back. Nothing happened to them. They just danced a bit on the waves, and in the propeller wash. As I'm sailing on racing yachts by myself, I can imagine how frightening that must have been. But honestly, don't cross a Tesla with a sailing yacht at night when you're not sure what's coming behind a commercial vessel when crossing their bow. Story 23. I can't recall seeing anything really unusual aside from wildlife and natural phenomenon. Passing through an area off Brazil, we saw a huge number of dolphins, whales, and seabirds feeding on what must have been massive shoals of fish. Plus, I did get to see the most magnificent sunrises and sunsets, spectacular, clear moonlit nights, the aurora, Arctic ice, penguins in southern Argentina, albatrosses, polar bears. Throw in a couple of trips through Suez and Panama canals too. Story 24. There are times when the ocean is completely flat and glassy like a mirror as far as you can see. After 2 years out on the oceans, I only saw it twice. Both times were somewhere in the middle of the Pacific. Another one, and probably my most favorite parts, is being 1,000 miles away from the coast on a night when there's a new moon. Just find out what night this happens and find your way to a spot and lay down and stare at the stars. I've talked to a lot of people in my life that claim to go camping to look at the stars at night, and they're at a campsite 10 or 12 miles from the city. I'll ask them, was it new moon phase? They usually have no idea what I'm talking about. Another thing is the complete difference between available light at night with full moon or new moon. Full mom AMD, most other nights, there's enough light available from the moon that you can walk around and see the crap on the boat. New moon, you can't see crap. You have to know your surroundings and where stuff is going to be. I would open the door, then step out and close the door. Then put my left hand on the bulkhead and feel my way down to where all our flags were stored. There were some storage cases and other crap right there that you could sit down or lay down on. It was just so relaxing. Story 25. Lots of spooky stuff here. So I'm gonna lighten up the mood. Northwest of Australia, a couple of days away from Dampier. 4/8 watch evening time. Already dark outside. Slowly the water was becoming green-bluish. You could distinguish the black horizon and the pitch-black outline of the ship, but the water was becoming more and more bright with this strange color. When the phenomenon was at its peak, the water was like a huge light was below it. Together with the darkness of a moonless night, the view was unique and magnificent. It seems that it was some kind of bioluminescent bleach. If you search it on Google, you can get an idea, but trust me, that night it was much, much greater. It is usually around the ship's hull as it moves through the waves, but what I'm talking about was for as far as the eye could see. I have heard many stories from older seafarers. One claimed that the ship was at the exact position an earthquake occurred near Japan, and the whole ship jumped. Tough to believe this one, but worth mentioning. Another one that the ship passed over the tsunami of 2004 in Indian Ocean, and the speed of the ship became 0 when it climbed over the wave. Story 26. My father was brought up in a fishing village in Donegal. He's not a sailor fisherman himself, although he once caught a sunfish on a boat off the coast near Mobile. But he has family that are, and despite that, none of them can swim. During the Second World War, Ireland was neutral. Times were tough for the locals, no imports, rationing, etc., and many young men left in pursuit of jobs so they could send money home to their families left behind. The tactical importance of Ireland wasn't lost on the soldiers who would enter Irish waters with their U-boats. My grandfather was the caretaker of an old fort, ex-British, situated on the coast with its own beach surrounded by cliffs, which my father would devilishly climb down as a youth with a makeshift crab pot. The fort was handed back to the Republic when the British Army left in the 1920s, when Ireland got their independence, and my grandfather got the job of caretaker, looking after the site, securing it, and ensuring it was kept in good order. My father was a young boy when his father would tell him stories about the mermaids and the fairies that would come out of the sea at nighttime and would warn my father and his siblings to never go anywhere near the sea in case they became trapped by these fairies and wouldn't be able to escape. Of course, fairies and mermaids are not real, but if a bombed German U-boat suddenly washed up on your beach with tinned food and other goodies, you would try to keep people away at least until you and your family and friends had a chance to look over it first and see what you could take. Story 27. 2 things. I was in the Navy and deployed to Persian Gulf 2X. First, it was like jellyfish season or something, and when you looked in the water, it looked like a massive amount of plastic bags, but it was all jellyfish. And at night, the splashes coming from the ship glowed like bluish purple. Pretty awesome. Second, still in Navy and outside of Hawaii, I had flight deck watch from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., basically standing on the flight deck trying to sneak naps in the intakes of chained jets. We are outside of Hawaii waiting for high tide, so we could get on shore. I see the Hawaiian Islands as the sun rises. Then I see a bunch of humpback whales breaching between the ship and the shore. Probably the most surreal, amazing thing I've ever seen. And I was alone just watching and basically tripping at how ducking awesome it was. Story 28. When I was a teenager, I was invited to go on a fishing trip with one of my friends. I had been deep sea fishing before, but anytime I'd go with my friend, it was serious. His family had this gigantic fishing boat that had several decks, with the highest one being like 30, 40 feet up. On this particular trip, we were fishing in the Keys for some dolphin, aka mahi-mahi. My friend's dad was naturally talented in putting us on the fish, and he would always tell us to go up top and look for birds, seaweed trails, or floating structures like wood or barrels. We see this frigate, big-ass bird, and yell down to him, so he corrects his course towards the bird. As we follow the bird for a bit, we can see this big floating piece of wood. We yell down that we see wood. We were 11 to 13 at the time, so we're making all these wood hoe jokes too. Everyone on the boat is freaking out because it's a great sign to see a bird or wood, but to have a bird headed right for some wood. We were about to catch some fish. We get closer and the ducking bird lands on this ducking wood like it's about to dive in for some fish. As we get closer, next thing we know, a big-ass shark pops out and snatches the bird. No ducking joke, this ducking shark just comes up out of nowhere. We were completely caught off guard. Craziest part is that the water was so clear that we can see this gigantic shark swimming around with the bird in its mouth. We were all speechless aside from my friend's dad, who is dying laughing and cursing up a storm. We ended up catching a lot of fish that day and definitely hooked up right in that area. I'll never forget it. Absolutely ridiculous thing to see. Story 29. I did some sailing on the East Coast and was sort of the galley wench so had a ton of experience and a little 37-foot O-day. I loved the day sails and the wing-to-wing runs. I agreed to crew a 50-foot boat from Annapolis to Key West one October. We had a few setbacks, bilge pump blew out, had to return to get a part, and some stormy seas. It was the first time I ever felt seasick. Captain was happy as we were making good time with the wind blowing good. 30 miles offshore, Miso hands another guy an uncleared line just as the wind shifted and blew that sail way out. I watched this guy lift off across the deck and land with his pinky stuck in a pulley with the line. He was screaming as Miso risked falling overboard, hanging over the deck and yanking hard on the line to unlock the pulley. Amazingly, he did set this guy's hand free without falling off the boat. With his pinky hanging perpendicular to the rest of his fingers, we put him in ice as the boat was reeling without the sail in place. Stuff flying out of cabinets, total chaos. My job was to call Pan Pan with our coordinates while they got the boat under control. I swear, out of freaking nowhere, this giant Navy warship materialized. They sent a dinghy with like 10 sailors with glow sticks and camouflage. It took us a while to tie the boats together since the seas were so rough. Once we did, the injured guy got on their dinghy, and I never saw him again. I heard he got his finger sewed back on. I got on a train home the next day. Story 30. Deckhand on a commercial fishing boat out of Nova Scotia, Canada, and I have a couple cool stories. Several mornings on our way out of the harbor to go long lining for halibut, I've seen what people call the green flash. Essentially, in the right conditions, at the exact instant the sun peaks above the horizon or sets below it, a brilliant emerald green wave of light flashes across the sky, originating from the point where the sun disappears. It's not as crazy what they depict in Pirates of the Caribbean, but it's still beautiful, and if you blink, you'd miss it. I've had plenty of encounters with whales and sharks around the boat, and those always make me feel like a kid again. On a more serious note, we were fishing for lobsters one rough day just outside the harbor. When the wind and sea is foul, you have to keep an eye on the shoals because when the sea heaves up, it can cause the water to break over the shoals, causing an immense wave called a breaker. One of these shoals hadn't been breaking all morning, and we were preoccupied doing something on deck and had drifted too close for comfort to the sleeping beast. I remember looking to the stern and was confronted by a 40-foot wall of water. For some perspective, the boat is only 30 feet long. The skipper slammed the throttle control and we ended up riding this breaker, holding on for dear life. The boat took a damn near 45-degree list and slammed us back to the sea. We lost some gear and everything was tossed and turned upside down. Skipper was cursing himself out the rest of the day, and we all were shaken up pretty badly. Very close to being capsized in rough seas during early May. Story 31. I suppose it was strange because my captain said he'd never seen it in all his years at sea. It was a massive tuna that breached like it was a dolphin. Story 32. My ship saved a guy who was sailing a small sailboat by himself from South Carolina to Ireland. The lamination in his hull started to come apart during a storm. He started to take on water. It was just fast enough that he could bail it out, but he had to be constantly bailing. He couldn't stop the flooding. He couldn't stop to sleep. He couldn't navigate. After 3 days, he threw in the towel and called for help, and we were the closest ship to him, so we saved him. Gave him a big trash barrel to put anything in it that he wanted to save. He used his small engine to come up to us, and when he got on the ladder, he threw the tiller so the boat sailed away, engine on, nobody home. We lost sight of it before we could watch it sink. I think journeys of that magnitude in such a small boat, maybe 25 or 30 foot, are stupid anyway, but if you're going to do it, please, for the love of God, don't do it alone. Story 33. Obligatory, not a sailor. Me and some friends booked a yacht for my buddy's bachelor party, our first big vacation as a friend group after college. I can't say that whether this is completely unusual on the ocean or if it was just me. Anyway, I woke up one night around 4 a.m. and decided to watch the sun come up and just enjoy the solitude after being with a bunch of guys partying for the last 8 days. I got out to the sitting area of the main deck, took a couple seconds to just enjoy the silence, and then there was just nothing, like no sounds whatsoever. Our yacht was completely still, as there were no waves to rock it, or even just slap up against the hull. It was eerily silent. So yeah, I tried to stay up there for a while, but eventually it was just unnerving, and I went back down to my bunk. Woke back up a few hours later and everything was normal again. Nothing spooky or paranormal, obviously, but I've just never seen the world that's still before or since. Story 34. I was serving on an aircraft carrier, either the USS Midway or the USD Independence, I can't remember which one, and went through a typhoon off the coast of Hong Kong back in the early 90s. There were two events that happened on the same day. The flight deck was cleared of all equipment, and the hangar bay was chockers. The hangar bay doors were mostly closed with the port-side stern door and the starboard forward doors left partially open to allow airflow. I took a shortcut across the hangar to get to a ladder that would take me up to the squadron ready room. I stopped to look out at the sea. There was a cruiser about a quarter mile from us. I watched the bow dip down into a trough and saw the screws come out of the water. The cruiser literally disappeared into that trough before cruising up the other side of the wave. I hadn't realized I was holding my breath until I saw its bow start to rise up the wave. I continued up to the ready room to deliver the papers I needed the skipper to sign. While I was waiting for him to finish talking to the XO, I was watching 5He flight deck camera feed when I saw this absolutely massive wave crash over the bow of the ship. The flight deck was 20 meters, 60 feet above the water surface, and the wave was higher than the bow. I was more afraid at that moment than at any other time when we were on station in the Persian Gulf. Story 35, just south of Jacksonville, FL, not far offshore. Relatively calm day, and 100 yards away from us, a giant manta ray with a wingspan of maybe 15 feet jumped a good 8 feet or so out of the water. Thing looked like it weighed 1,000 pounds. I think it could have sunk our 27-foot boat if it happened to land on us. I spoke to some saltier types in the area and they said what I saw was not too common, but far from unheard of. Apparently, the largest one found had nearly a 30-foot wingspan. I simply had no idea such creatures existed and was awed almost to the point of disbelief and almost to the point of wetting my pants to see one in that setting. Story 36, not mine, but from a closer friend who used to work on a squid fishing boat in the south of Argentina. He said it was pretty late in the night, around 3 a.m. Outside it was pitch black, so some of the crew and the captain were outside just having a smoke when they saw in the horizon an almost faded orange color. They were wondering if it could be the sun, so the captain decided to go in that direction. After a while, the orange color started to be more and more solid, and suddenly it looked like it was a distant city and its lights. They were deep in the Argentinian Sea, and according to the GPS, they were nowhere close to the coast. By this point, everybody got up and were outside trying to understand why there were lights in the middle of nowhere. The captain kept going closer and closer, and according to my friend, it was like hundreds of orange lights just floating over the sea. When they finally got closer enough, they realized it was hundreds of boats fishing, all with Chinese flags, fishing illegally in Argentinian waters. Someone called on the radio, saying something in another language. The captain didn't reply. They reported it to the Navy and went away because it could be dangerous. But he said it was like a city popped out of nowhere. Story 37, Northern Lights and then strangest fog in the Strait of Juan de Fuca. The lights were great, coming out of Clallam Bay after a mark, and the Northern Lights were dancing. Just on the east side of the bay was a fog bank we could see. No problem. I was solo on the deck helm, sail in, hold course, correct a little. Note, I'm an instrument-rated pilot and fly in the clouds all the time. This was so different. I entered the fog and all hell broke loose. Winds increased 15 meters and shifted down 80 degrees. I couldn't even see my weather vane. I did 2 360s until just pushing for course blindly. Now we run 2 compasses on our racing boat, and both had fogged over, so I had lost direction. Our chart plotter showed we went from 4 kts to 12 kts and held that through the fog for the next hour. Strangest weather event I've ever seen. Fog is usually the calm place, but we hit some inverse advection fog. Not sure how to explain it. 8 hours later, still in the fog, more crew woke up later and were on deck. We watched a 45-foot boat do a 360 as they came out of the fog. This was all within 100s of rocks at sailing depth. The rate they went around, something had to break as it was more a leisure and not a hardened race sailboat like we were on. They definitely jibed twice, at least once in 10 seconds. We wondered if they hit the rocks, but they did complete the race, so likely not. Story 38. When I was a child, my sister and I used to go sailing with my dad and uncle. One day, a terrible storm blew in when we were at sea and not in the bay where the dock was. My sister and I were rushed below decks with life jackets on and sternly admonished to not come up for any reason. The lightning was crashing, the boat tossing to and fro, and then it fell over. My sister said she saw a fish out of the side window as it was in the water because we were horizontal. My father said later that he fell in, but as he was holding a rope, he pulled himself back into the boat when it righted itself from the knockdown. Fast forward 20 plus years. My teen daughter gets invited in a boat trip with family friends. I have a terrible feeling about the trip, but push the feeling aside and tell myself that I'm paranoid. Later that evening, I get a call that a horrible storm came. Same story. They were caught out at sea, girls sent below, knocked down, almost sink. The man who owned the boat told me that he had to rip the sail off the mast, and he knew that they were going to pass. But my daughter said she wasn't scared because she was going to heaven. He and his wife apologized a million times for going out when no other boats did that day. How bizarre is that? Story 39, 1986, USS New Jersey. Nearly 900 feet of battleship in the Bering Sea during a storm. 50, 60-foot seas. 3 of us went up to the 0 to 12 deck, weren't supposed to be topside. And I have a picture of a third of the ship underwater. It was intense. Story 40. I was working on a charter boat, and we were taking it out to park at another marina, and we saw a diver's fin floating and a snorkel. We then noticed a group of sea lion dragging a mass onto a rock, then dragging it back on under. Back and forth, playing with it. We get closer and notice the mass has a fin and pieces of wetsuit. We got up to them and tried to get them to stop so we could recover the body, but the rocks were too rough for us to get close. We call it into the Coast Guard and let them know that it looks like a wetsuit and diving gear and a body. They let us know they will send someone out. About 15 minutes go by and a sea lion grabs the body and drags it right out to our boat. Then we see broken foam and plastic in chunks. It was a mannequin. We called off the Coast Guard, but they already sent someone out, so they checked. We all had a good laugh, but we were all kind of pissed now. Many hours of our day were wasted on it. Story 41. At sea on a NZ warship, sailing home after an overseas deployment. Had a bit of insomnia, so got up to get some fresh air. A ship never sleeps, but it dozes, and she was a quiet night as I went out to the quarterdeck to stare at the wake for a while. There was no moon, a clear night, so I let my eyes adjust to the darkness. We were steaming through a patch of phosphorescence, and the wake was glowing bright green, and then it happened. A pod of dolphins chose that moment to swim into the wake and ride the pressure waves for a while. They were zooming in and out of the phosphorescence, leaving their own green glowing trails as they leapt in and out of the wake, and I was the only person there to see it. I watched them play non-stop for over an hour. I've seen some wonders in my life, but that is a memory that will stay with me forever. Story 42. I've only been out a few times on my ship in the US Coast Guard, but seeing countries from a distance never gets old to me. Haiti, Cuba, Turks and calicos, etc. A random fish popping out of the open ocean. Sunsets and sunrises spent outside on watch. The Panama Canal and Gatun Lake are among the most impressive and beautiful things I've ever seen. Also, handmade Cuban migrant rafts. Heartbreaking work. But the ingenuity and resourcefulness of those people amazes me. To set out on the open ocean on a boat made of pallets and styrofoam is something else. Safety of life at sea is one of our biggest reasons for interdiction. Story 43. Not a sailor, but my family are commercial fishermen, and I'd go on trips with them during high school and college breaks for money. I saw a tiger shark get caught by accident give birth on the deck as all of the fish were flopping around, and the little baby sharks were biting the other fish as we were trying to get the sharks overboard to save their lives, if you can believe it. This was 2 miles offshore the beach I normally swim off of. We've caught great whites there too. Giant electric fish, these blobs, would shock the whole pile of fish and they'd all jump up like crazy. Better be wearing rubber boots. I also had a seagull crap directly down my throat through my slightly open mouth as I was looking up, which is why I can't eat raw oysters because the taste and consistency is similar. Story 44. While at sea, we were on our way home from a Westpac. We went to the Gulf, our Marines disembarked and participated in OEF. On the way home, we were between Hawaii and San Diego. A Marine was by the trash drop-off, stripped down to his green shirt and shorts and jumped overboard. He was witnessed jumping, so they immediately called for a man overboard. My deputy was responsible for some SAR coordination, so we are all gathered around a scope and listening to the radio. After 2 hours, the helicopter spotted the guy, alive. They sent in rescue swimmers. Then we hear the pilot say something along the lines of, "He's swimming away from the rescue swimmers." The fact that this guy was chilling out to sea and still had the stamina, I assume he was great at floating. To swim away from the rescue swimmers was amazing to me. Story 45. As a kid, my family and I spent our summers on a 50-foot sailboat in New England. A lot of time around Cape Cod, Martha's Vineyard and such. One day there was heavy fog. I was 12 maybe. My dad sent me up to the bow and used a canister air horn every once in a while. There was no wind, and I could hear and feel the old diesel engine chugging us along, the sound of the bells from the markers. And as I'm standing at the bow, I see a huge fish head emerging out of the fog. To my 12-year-old eyes, it was a monster coming out of the depths to grab me, scared of the crap out of me. I believe it was a tuna's head that had been cut off and left floating. Another amazing moment is in the outer harbor of Provincetown. A pod of hundreds of dolphins came in, and me, my brother and sister jumped in the dinghy, would drive in front of the pod, cut the engine, and just sit while all these dolphins enveloped us. I complained a lot as a kid, spending my springs and falls in the boatyard, sanding, painting, and fixing you name what on that old boat. But now I'm 35 and saving up for my own big old boat to get out there and adventure again. Story 46. I was sailing under an air show and a Vulcan came low and slow for a flyby. It went straight over our head before going full afterburners and vertical. As I was watching the plane, another boat upwind of us fell over as me and my crew sat there laughing as it seemed like a bit of an amateur mistake. Our boat just got blown flat. As I stood on the centerboard wondering what on earth happened, you could see a mini tornado surging across the water. It was then we realized we got hit by the jet wash of the plane also had a channel crossing in a yacht in gale force winds. We're screaming along on the edge of control with the spinnaker up. On the horizon, we can see a cargo ship, and ACE tracking system says we're clear of it by a mile. As we get closer, we keep track of speed and course and can see the ship is changing to go faster and point towards us, creating what was a mile clearance to a head-on collision. We either drop the spinnaker and hope to God we don't have a problem, or we try and head a little closer to the wind and get behind the ship. Now with even less control, and the boat nearly on its side, we create enough space to pass 100 millimeters behind. Story 47, Bermuda to Haiti, saw a massive solid beam of light go from the stars down to the water. Entire crew saw it. No one had an answer or theory. So bizarre. Saw Bermuda to Haiti. My watch officer described the weirdest fish he had ever seen. 2 glowing orbs at the end of 2 tentacles extending from a large wahoo-like fish that was reticulated with bioluminescent dots. 10 years later, while working at a museum, William Beebe's bathysphere fish had that exact description, Bermuda to Antigua. A line snapped on our jib sail, and the captain caught the loose line, an amazing feat. And while walking back to the cabin showboating, a flying fish jumped out of the water and hit the back of his knee. He collapsed backwards on himself, and the fish fell back overboard. So he jumped back up, confounded, wondering what had happened. Bermuda to Antigua. Crew bought a projector and forgot the manual at port. So to get it working, we decided to try every combination on the remote projector to find a way to connect it to my phone without Wi-Fi Bluetooth. After an hour of caveman tier logic, we get it operational, just as we cheer some waterflies through an open porthole onto the projector and fries it. Story 48. Being the middle of nowhere and seeing a star go streaking straight across the sky, and when I said, wow, the aft watch said, wait a half hour, sure as crap there was again in the same spot. It was a satellite on a geosynchronous orbit. Story 49. I was crew on a sailboat going from the South Caribbean to New England. I really enjoyed the solo watches at 1 or 2 in the morning. It feels surreal to be a speck on the open ocean, 800 miles from land. The only person awake, no other traffic by sight or radar. The only light is a red headlamp and a blip on the mast, and the sky. On a clear night, the sky was breathtaking. Stars like no one on land can ever see. The sky felt alive with light. Then add to that the bioluminescence of the sea. The boat would gently rise and fall in 15-foot seas, and each rise the boat digs in a bit, and spray and scree spreads about 20 feet to the lee. Any water completely wakes up with greens, blues, reds, little points of light sparkling in the foam as a wave passes underneath. All the light of the sky completely matched by light in the sea, with me and my boat suspended somehow between. Because a sailboat is so low, only a few feet from the water, it feels like you can stick out a finger and touch light everywhere, above or below. And there you are, in a world of billions, experiencing this completely alone. Story 50. One of the funniest things I've experienced was when I was on deployment in the Persian Gulf. Every day at 2 a.m., a guy would yell out over the radio comms, "Filipino monkey! Filipino monkey! I want to talk to all the ships! Filipino monkey!" After about the 3rd or 4th night, another guy got tired of listening to Filipino monkey and yelled back to shut TF up. Filipino monkey guy, start yelling, "Filipino monkey!" And the two of them yelled back and forth for an hour or so, haha. On my ship, we couldn't turn it off due to something my ship was doing. So every day with listen to Filipino monkey radio at 2 a.m., Story 51, charter fisherman for 16 years on Lake Michigan. The lake was glass and we were out fishing. I was up top getting ready to do a slight course change for the autopilot and notice a single wave line stretching from horizon to horizon coming from the southwest. I'm on the west side of Michigan. The single wave was at least 5 feet. There was no boats anywhere near me. I even spun up and maxed out the Garmin radar to 75 miles and not a single blip except for all the boats close to shore to my east. Still the strangest experience ever. Rogue wave, underwater earthquake, who knows? Story 52, commercial fishing. I saw a dolphin giving birth with another holding her up. An oil rig being delivered that was so tall, it disappeared in the clouds, and a seemingly empty cargo ship almost ran us over. The nastiest thing I ever saw was a man dressed in a nightgown, tied to a bow in a storm for whining. I had also never seen a real tuna fish or Goliath grouper. They're as big as Volkswagen. Story 53, living in a fishing town in the Mediterranean. So I hear a lot of stories during coffee, some interesting stuff like us fighter jets flying at really low altitude, but best story is this one really long time ago. So these guys were fishing, and in the middle of the night, they see something of their radar or whatever. Guy goes out and sees nothing, pitch dark. When they are very near, he goes out, shines a floodlight, and sees an abandoned ship in front of the boat. They do a stupid thing. They radio their mates, who meet them with oxyacetylene, etc., and ransack the thing. Then they drag it to port. Looks like in Seafinders or Keepers, and they missed it an opportunity to make a lot of money. It stayed anchored in a scrapyard, and eventually was sold for metal. Story 54. I was stationed on board a guided missile cruiser for 3 years. One day we were in the middle of the Pacific Ocean when we came across a lifeboat. This lifeboat was very similar to the one from the Tom Hanks movie, Captain Phillips. Our ship plastered the horns and circled it a few times, attempting to see if there was any life on board. After no response from the boat, we lowered one of our boats and motors up to the lifeboat. Of course, we had an armed boarding party, and it seemed the entire crew of the ship was watching and wondering what is going to happen. It gets pretty boring out there, so that was very exciting. The boarding party enters the boat, and we hear over the radio that the boat was empty and had shown no sign of life. We surmised that the boat had fallen off a container ship, perhaps in a storm. Our next mission was to sink it. The gunner's mates brought up to 50 cows and fired upon it until it sank. Story 55. The most unusual thing is the sea itself, majesty and the horror. I served on 4 different submarines for over 22 years. I was a radio man on 1 fast attack, 2 old boomers, and 1 new Trident submarine. Nevada, 733 gold. Boats spend 90% of their time submerged, and when on the surface, only the officer of the deck, OOD, the lookout, and the messenger went up into the bridge. Everyone else was just a brief visitor. I would go up to deliver important messages to the OOD. Usually, I brought an empty clipboard. I loved going up to the bridge and conspired to do so often. The view, my God, the view. You're so far out into the ocean that there is nothing but water visible. Early morning is great, as you can see the light coming in subtle ways after about 3 a.m. Magnificent. The quiet, the incredible color, the majesty of it all. I never knew how privileged I was. Then I climbed back down into the gray boat for another month, or 2. Oh yeah, privilege story 56. Mentioned some crap earlier regarding my time out to sea, but thought I should also mention this. We were off the coast of Central or South America. Don't remember which was 30 years ago. One of our watches spotted something on the horizon. When you're out to sea, you have to render aid. After the watch spotted this thing on the horizon, we headed towards the contact and found a fishing vessel that had capsized with 4 or 5 guys on it. We got the guys on board and towed the boat back into port. I can't remember the laws involved, but you're not supposed to leave crap like that out floating around. Some kind of good-willed hazards to navigation stuff. Those guys had been on that capsized boat for 4 or 5 days. They had been catching small fish that they had been drying and eating. Don't remember how they stayed hydrated. Anyway, should have led with that. We saved some lives that day. Story 57. When I was in the Navy, I worked on the flight deck. We wore NVGs at night during flight operations. Between events, we would stand outside and stare up at the sky. You could see the rest of the Milky Way really well. You could also see lots of other things moving around in the sky. Things that didn't have anti-collision lights like our aircraft or others. The flashes of light from them get picked up really well with NVGs. Don't know what they were, but definitely wasn't commercial or ours. Also got a good look at some really nice shooting stars. I also saw a crapload of squids glowing in the dark before. I should also mention that in the middle of the ocean without a full moon, it is extremely dark and quite terrifying when you walk outside by yourself. Makes you wonder what's really down in the ocean. Or at least I did. Story 58. When I was in the Navy, I served on a ship with a flat earther. I don't know how someone goes to sea and continues to believe that the earth is flat. There's no experience that makes it clearer that the earth is round, than sailing the ocean. Story 59. Coming into Australia once, I went to the top of the mast to refill the oil on some kit. When I got to the top of the mast, I looked around and for some reason the water was white. It was calm out, but the water was completely white as far as I could see, in all directions. It took me a few seconds to realize that we had sailed into a gigantic school of jellyfish. It was surreal. It also ducked our ship up a bit. Ships use seawater for cooling auxiliary systems, and our seawater intake filters got clogged with jellyfish and we could barely pressurize our firemen. Story 60 was in the US Navy on lookout. Around 2 in the morning, somewhere in the middle of the Pacific, I spotted a strange plane that was pink and blue flashing lights. These are not normal colors of plane lights. Control insisted it was a satellite because they couldn't see it on the radar. It wasn't no damn satellite. It was much bigger than any stars around it, the usual size of a plane in atmosphere. Or some kind of rocket maybe? After a few minutes, it disappeared. No, I don't believe in aliens, but we weren't near any sort of landmass for hundreds of miles. Story 61. My grandpa was a commercial fisherman on the coast of Oregon. One year, I was spending the summer with him, fishing, working, and saving money for college as a teen. We had a gray whale lift his 50-foot boat right out of the water and look at us. The eye was right off the port side and was about the size, shape, and color of a football. He reached over and gave it a scratch. It then led us back into the water and went about its day. Story 62. Used to run to Catalina from LA to fish all the time. 26-mile run. Gotta head back by early afternoon or the swells get really big and in a 26-cuddy cabin it gets rough. Brother and I had a good day out and were catching all kinds of fish and didn't pay attention to the time. Started heading back around 3 p.m. Must have been a storm coming in because the swells were easily 12-knot high. We'd get in between a set and look to either side and there would be a wall of water higher than the top of the sunshade over the helm. Like, you gotta look up to see the top of the wall of water on either side of you. Pray the motor doesn't stall, power up the swell, coast down. Repeat for 2 hours till you're back in the harbor. Good times. Story 63. 1. Seeing a purple night sky. 2. Being tailed by a Russian sub and nuclear-powered cruiser for a month. 3. Sailor from another ship tried to end his life by jumping overboard. As soon as landed in the water, she regretted the decision and treaded water for almost 6 hours in the Atlantic Ocean. 2 other ships eventually found her and rescued her. Story 64. This past summer, my wife and I watched something crawl in the night sky, something that can be best described as a skyworm. It had a halo of shimmery light around it and was similar to a firework that wouldn't go away in the night sky in a remote area over the Mississippi River. We watched it grow and shrink in length for 30 seconds. It was the most scary, beautiful, and unexplainable memory of my life, and I am so appreciative to share that memory with someone I deeply love. Story 65. Not a sailor, but a lot of time on boats. I will mention 2, deep sea fishing off Costa Rica and coming back to shore. A pod of dolphins stared racing playing with the boat, was sitting on the bow, and 15 to 20 dolphins just raiding and jumping right in front of your feet. A few feet from the boat was amazing. The other was on a sailboat in northern Australia by the GBR, and we pulled into a cove to swim, and while swimming, a small humpback whale was still huge, came in the bay and checked us out. It was wild to go under with goggles and see this huge whale. We got out of the water when it got really close and just watched from the deck. Amazing sight. Story 66. Bioluminescence anywhere makes you feel like you're in Avatar. And on my boat, the toilet is salt water. So if you go to the bathroom in the night and flush, the water then comes in as glowing. When 2 oceans meet, you can see the 2 different bodies of water and the line between them. Once I sailed at night past an island on fire, uninhabited and very small, but a very surreal thing to go past on a very calm night. During whale season, if you have to go in the water for whatever maintenance reason or to fish, the second your head is underwater, it sounds like the whales are right on top of you. They are so loud, but nowhere near you. Story 67. We were fishing in a bay with several other boats. The fog suddenly rolled in, but it was only about 4 or 5 feet high on the water. All the boats disappeared and all you could see was guys standing up in the fog fishing. It looked like fishing in heaven. This was pre-cell phone, so no photo, but I would have loved to have a photo of it. Story 68. I was just offshore from a beach when I spotted 2 dolphins. One of them leapt through the air toward my boat, over and over, at least 10 times. Swim a few feet, jump, swim, jump, jump, repeat, like SeaWorld tricks. They continued past my boat toward the beach. I don't know why, but I suspected there were sharks nearby and perhaps the jumping dolphin was giving a warning. Within a couple of minutes, I saw several large sharks in the area where the dolphins came from. Maybe coincidence, but I never forgot it. Story 69. Former Navy. Was off the west coast of Central America, 600 Nil Ramirez. Clear night. Sea state 3 or less. Went into an area of what I can only call darkness. Nothing on radar for weather. The stars and the moon just disappeared. We were running dark, but there is enough ambient light from the bridge equipment that you can normally see the guardrails and the deck on the breezeways. Just nothing. I stepped outside to get eyes on, and it was the most still and most eerie airs I've ever seen, and deathly silent. I rushed back in to check A's and radar, to double check, and nothing. 5 minutes later, it was gone. Still get shivers thinking about it when I do. Story 70. In college, I did a semester abroad with Sea Education Association and sailed a schooner from Cape Cod to the Caribbean. Within a week of departure, we ended up in a huge Force 10 extratropical storm, basically a hurricane. 3 days of riding out waves that peaked at 30 hours, taking boarding waves that put several feet of water on deck. During one of these boarding waves, our second mate thrown so hard against the wooden steering wheel that it broke in half. Below deck, we had gimbaled dining tables. They move as the ship lists to remain flat. We rolled so hard that everything on the table went flying into the cabin wall. Wildest experience of my life? Story 71. Not a sailor, but a friend was on Great Lakes or boats. He said the worst weather he was ever in was on Lake Erie. The waves were so big that he swears he saw the bottom in the lake in the wave trough. In case you're not familiar, the lake is an average of 60 fathoms deep. Story 72. Oh man, I only sailed for 2 weeks, so I don't know how usual things are. But at one point, the bobstay pin broke, and we had to dangle the first and second mates in the cold-ass Atlantic to fix it so the rigging didn't fall on it. The foreboom cracked, and we wrapped it tightly in twine to just keep it together. Basically, it was a rough shakedown sail from Seattle to Georgia. We also got to sail next to some whales, which was sick as hell. They didn't breach dramatically or anything, but you can tell they're there because the water flattens on the surface whenever they move their tails. Story 73. Fishing offshore in Florida, dolphin porpoise are not unusual, but usually in schools of 5 or so. One day we came across hundreds and hundreds, in small pods of 5 to 7, but pods everywhere, over what would be blocks. Cool as crap. We stopped trolling and just stayed with them briefly. All around our boat, checking us out, which isn't unusual, everywhere. Going north. Story 74. Well, our ship caught fire and it burned through the electrical cables that would provide emergency power if both reactors were shut down. One of the reactors shut down, we lost 2 coolant loops on the other reactor, and the only reason we didn't go dead in the water was because the watch officer ordered the reactor operator to not scram the reactor and to continue operating on 2 loops. It's a really big deal because you're really not supposed to operate on only 2 coolant loops due to an uneven neutron flux, creating uneven uranium burnout, which skews the calculations for reactor power production. They didn't know at the time that there was no emergency backup power. Story 75. In the Gulf of Mexico recently, we saw a pretty awesome weather event right before a big storm. On one side of our ship, it was dark as night all around, except for a single streak of dull light right at the horizon. And on the opposite side, it was overcast, but generally a normal-looking day, aside from a streak of dark gray right along the horizon. Not sure what would cause the sky to almost look polar opposite like that on each side of our ship, but it was really cool to see. Story 76. I was on a new research vessel as part of the team that was doing its shakedown on its first Antarctic trip to test its polar capabilities. On the way back, we were at sea in the region of the South Magnetic Pole, and an aurora formed directly over us. I'd seen auroras before, but never one directly overhead. There were vertical curtains of glowing green light forming directly above us, and they looked like they were pointing in our direction. I'm not a religious person, but my primal being was expecting the hand of God to reach down to us. It was just what I expect being visited by angels would be like. Story 77. I have a story about almost getting run down by an 800 feet Great Lakes freighter in a thick fog bank. We were on a 35-foot racing sailboat. Couldn't see the bow from the cockpit, fog was so bad. A crew member said, "I hear a bow wake," and moments later, a wall of steel appeared out of the fog. We were sailing right into the side of it. We could have touched it with a boat pole. That was the most scared I've ever been on the water. Story 78. I was on a jack-up drilling rig under tow in the North Sea for 4 days when it should have been 12-hour tow. Weather came up and we couldn't pin the rig, lower the legs to the seabed. So we went in circles waiting for the seas to subside, with up to 10 mirror swells and green water breaking over the jackhouses. Pretty much everybody on board was seasick. I didn't barf, but had to go outdoors a few times to let the freezing cold sailor spray straighten me out. Good times. Story 79. I don't consider myself a sailor, and it probably isn't unusual. But the first and only time I ever set out to sea so far that couldn't see land over the horizon, I was struck by a deep sense of dread and unease. I knew I was far from anything I understood, with several miles of water beneath me and leagues of sea around me. I couldn't sleep that night and didn't want to get back on the boat for the ride home, even though I had to. I don't have any desire to return to sea anytime or soon. Story 80. I did work on fishing boats, but the strangest thing I've experienced at sea was surfing at dusk and then into the night in a bioluminescent tide, getting little close-out barrels at a beach break where the lip of the wave landing in front of the wave created an explosion of greenish bioluminescent light. Paddling each stroke, my hands and arms would create a swirl of light around them, and the surfboard had swirls of light coming off the edges as it moved through the water. Totally amazing experience. Story 81. It was a long while ago. In the pitch-black night, we were sailing off Coast Sicilia, and for a brief moment of time, sky was so bright reddish-orange, all of us on the bridge thought hell-raising, and we'll all be dead soon. But soon enough, after everything settled, we've realized that it was Etna decided to present us a light show, and it was so freakishly mesmerizing. I think it was a good start for the career. And also quite unique views. You can see in the night all the stardust glowing over you, or phytoplanktons lighting the route for you. Story 82. I worked on a bulk carrier for a short time. Woke up one morning, out we go on deck to work as normal. Quite a lot of dead fish on deck, presumably flying fish. The rest of the crew didn't seem to think much of it, so can't have been that uncommon. But still, didn't expect to be throwing lots of dead fish into the sea that morning. Story 83. My dad's bestie used to captain these huge cargo ships around Africa. They got a little too close to Somalia, and as happens when one does that, pirates attempted to seize the ship. They had to essentially blast the crap out of people with fire hoses. He doesn't talk about it much. Story 84. I was an engineer, so there wasn't too much outside that I saw. But one of the more surreal ones was on a cloudless night with a full moon and calm seas. I went on deck around 0030 after finishing a watch, and there was a shipping container still half afloat, bobbing up and down and setting off the glow of the phytoplankton, maybe 200 meters off the ship's side. I radiated the bridge to confirm they'd seen it, and they'd registered it about half an hour ago. Not necessarily the most unusual of things, but still surreal. Story 85. I was on a boat pickup and delivery job from St. Thomas to St. Kitts and back to St. Thomas during the peak of the COVID pandemic. Middle of the night, there was a huge cruise ship, empty minus crew, that wasn't allowed to pull into any port. It was completely lit up as it would be for an occupied cruise. On the tracking system we had, it was just moving along at 1 knot. So basically just drifting around, powered up to avoid hitting anything out at sea. Reminded me of the movie Ghost Ship. Story 86. Not the ocean, but 26 miles offshore in Lake Michigan. We found one of those giant floating swim mats rolled up, pulled up to it, hove to, and tried to get it aboard, but it was so waterlogged, it weighed hundreds of pounds, so it'd been out there a while. Story 87. Jamming my arm shoulder deep into a sewage header, big crap pipe, with years of buildup to break up a clog. Or maybe the time the first engineer, third engineer, and I broke the truth to one of our oilers that adult film is in fact scripted. Not really things I have to do, usually. Story 88. Not quite a sailor, but I've been on a cruise in bad weather to the point dishware was sliding off tables. You could feel the slight panic in the air. My brother also once hooked up with a nice barracuda that jumped over the bimini top of the boat. I had no idea they could launch that far. Story 89. I was anchored at Fort Jefferson. We had traded with some Cuban lobstermen, lobsters for beer. Anyhow, I woke up in the middle of the night. It was dark, like dark. No moon. I was in my bunk and I started seeing these glowing things in front of me. I was sleepy and not a little drunk. Anyhow, after more than a few seconds of confusion, I finally realized my fingernails were all glowing. The phosphorescence had soaked into my nails from eating the lobster. Story 90. Random light and sounds. I was standing watch one evening when there were no winds and it was dead calm. I looked down and there were light streaks everywhere. Not like eels or jellyfish, but just lightning-looking beams at various spots around our ship. Another time, I was aft and heard what I thought was a diesel engine starting up. There were no other crafts in our area for at least 100 miles. Story 91. As a young kid, me 5 and my sister 8, our parents would go diving, leaving us on the boat, above firmly told not to get out. We'd see all kinds of life swim by and occasionally on the shore of nearby island. It didn't occur to me until years later how much our parents sucked at those moments. Story 92. Went to Catalina and was exploring the little hidden coves and beaches along the east end when I came across an anchored motorboat. As soon as our engine was audible, 3 gals, all of whom were topless, 2 of whom were naked, stood up, without shame I might add, to see who was approaching, while 2 sheepish guys peeked over the sides. My son received an impromptu anatomy lesson that day. Story 93. We were sailing back to Long Beach, California from Catalina Island. All of a sudden, there was a fish boil about 40 feet off the port side that was about as big as a football field. Thousands of fish, some as big as me, were jumping out of the water. We were all thinking the same thing. What the hell is down there? Chasing them! Story 94. Not unusual, but freaking amazing. My dad and I were sailing in the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and found ourselves in the middle of a massive pod of orcas. All we could do was sit tight and watch them swim by. It took over an hour. Luckily, none of them hit the boat. I took 4 rolls of pictures back before digital. Like I said, amazing. Story 95, compression of a 33-inch diameter submarine hull by approximately 6 when submerged. If the hull didn't flex, it would have broken. There, we lived in a device that could do such a thing, with a nuclear reactor and terrible coffee. Story 96. Years ago, sailing up the California coast about 100 miles offshore, we weathered a modest storm. The swell remained in the aftermath, but we were becalmed. The ocean's surface reflected the overcast sky to the extent that it was impossible to discern the horizon or differentiate sea from sky. We appeared to be floating on a giant pool of liquid mercury. Pretty awesome. Story 97. On my parents' sailboat off the coast of Madagascar. Anchored at Nosy Iranja. In the middle of the night, my mother wakes me up to go up top and the full moon is out. No clouds, and the white sand that connects the 2 parts of the island is glowing in the moonlight. Absolutely unforgettable and stunning. What a beautiful sight. And glad I got to share it with my mom. Story 98. I've seen a lot of things, some of which are unfortunately not unusual. Sinking ship, distress, glowing algae, etc. But the most unusual was a sudden change in wind direction on the middle of the ocean. The tops of the waves were changing perpendicular to the rest of the wave. It was a really odd sight, which I've only seen once in my 9 years at sea. Story 99. Anchored on a boat in Guadalupe, I woke up in the night to go pee and saw jellyfish momentarily glowing all over the bay. They may have been exciting phytoplankton because it was the same color as we had seen before. Story 100. On an oil tanker south of Valdez, watched ball lightning about the size of a beach ball slide aft about 100 feet, down a handrail, jump over, and climb a vent stack shroud, then poof, flash and gone. Also got hit by a shockwave from an undersea earthquake, but didn't get to see it. The guys on the bridge did though. Sailors, what's the creepiest thing you've ever seen or experienced at sea? Story 1. On a boat in Alaska, recording humpback whale sounds. We picked up an odd, rhythmic noise on the hydrophone. We were on a 100-foot schooner around Admiralty Island near Juneau. Nothing seen on the surface, just this odd, repetitious mechanical sound. The skipper contacted the local authorities, who seized the tape and spent several hours interviewing. Not that scary, but surely weird. Story 2. I was serving on a Coast Guard vessel in the Barents Sea in the late 1990s. This is an area very rich with fish, so a big part of the Coast Guard's job in the area was policing, rescuing, and inspecting fishing ships. The closest coastline to the Barents Sea is the Russian Kola Peninsula, so the majority of the fishing vessels there were Russian. One day, while patrolling the area, we noticed a fishing ship moving in a strange pattern. Usually, the trawlers would move like in a herd, following the fish stem, but this vessel would keep moving in and out of the fleet and often moving up right next to other ships in the fleet before moving out again. This seems to us as very strange behavior for a fishing ship, so we decided to send out a boarding party to inspect the vessel. I was on this party. When we came aboard, to our surprise, there were no fishing equipment on the deck, and it didn't seem like the boat had been trawling at all. Still, we had to do a proper inspection and see what was in the cargo. When we moved inside the boat, we noticed that a lot of the lights inside the boat was changed to red, and there was a smell of old booze and sweat instead of the normal smell of fish. We came into the cargo hold. It was even stranger when the cargo hold also turned out to be empty, so they were not supplying the fleet or taking their catch to shore. On our way up to the bridge, we suddenly figured out what was going on. One of the crew lugers had no door, and the bunk beds inside were filled with scanty-dressed Russian girls. It turned out it was a floating brothel servicing the fishermen out at sea. This might not seem as much to some, but to a Norwegian it made me realize how good my life was compared to these people living across the border, especially considering both the girls and the fishermen were around my own age. 2. This is not me, but my father, who was commercial sailor from the 50s to the 70s. He was on tanker crossing the Pacific Ocean. They were far from land and kind of in the middle of the ocean. The Pacific Ocean is big, very big, so the chance of meeting other vessels out there is very slim. Still, one night, when it was completely dark, dots started to appear on the radar. This was in the 60s, so radar technology wasn't close to what it is today. So my father went out to the bridge wing to see if he could see any lanterns. Nothing. When he came back to the bridge, he saw that the radars were now completely covered with dots all around the ship. Big dots, too, but still not a single lantern in sight. My father thought it must be a malfunction or some weather causing it. Still, the water was flat, and weather seemed calm, so he made a call on the radio for any ships in the area. Immediately, he got an answer from an American voice. It turned out he had managed to cross paths with an American carrier group on maneuver in the middle of the Pacific. He then requested if they could turn their lights on so he could maneuver safely out of their fleet. Suddenly, within a few seconds, as he described it, it was like a whole city materialized out of the darkness around them. From horizon to horizon, there were huge carriers, supply ships, escort ships, and whatnot. The contrast of being alone in the vast ocean for days to this was very strange. He managed to maneuver the tanker through the myriad of ships, and when he came to the outskirts of the fleet, suddenly, as soon as they appeared, the whole fleet went completely dark again. Gone. Once again, the ship was totally alone in the vast dark ocean. He described the encounter as the strangest feeling he experienced during 30 years at sea. Story 3. I wouldn't say it's creepy, but just scary. I have a buddy who is a submariner. They were on deployment for 6 months and were told they were going to be extended 4 days. One of my buddy's best friends waited till he was asleep and attacked him. He tried to hit him. No one expected this guy to do anything like that. When you are stuck in a tin can, it changes people. You don't see the sun for 6 months. You don't have contact with your family or friends. That's one of the creepiest stories I've heard. Story 4. My granddad's brother, great uncle, was in the Navy for the majority of his life. I loved it when he'd visit because he'd always tell me cool stories. Most were just of storms or cool things that have happened to him, but one stuck with me. He was in the North Sea, and it was a particularly bad storm. He and his friends were convinced they saw Viking long ships. He was ridiculed every time he brought it up, but he never faltered from his story. No big flashy event or anything other than a group of around a dozen Viking longboats rowing through the storm. He told it way better, but to this day, I believe him. It's the only time he ever mentioned anything even slightly creepy like that. Story 5. Not a sailor, but I've spent more time out at sea than most because of my fondness for most boat-related stuff. Even though I enjoy being out there, it always has kind of an eerie feel. I live in the south of Norway, and the North Sea is really dark. Even on the most beautiful days, you can max see a meter down. Well, this one time, I was out by myself in a pretty small, about 14 feet boat. It was one of these not sunny, but still adequate weather days. Well, long story short, I lost control over the engine, and my boat spun around, landing me just underneath it. As I saw mentioned in another post, I have never felt as vulnerable as just then, floating at the top of a big nothing. You know there is nothing for possibly hundreds of feet underneath you. Probably the worst part of it is when you have to duck under the boat to get up and away. You just stare down into the abyss. You can choose not to look, but then it's almost just worse. There are no big sharks or that sort here, but still. You feel like there is just something down there in the dark. I managed to keep calm, and after about half an hour, someone must have spotted me, because I was soon picked up by the local SAR boat. I still don't like to look down into water, but I will continue enjoying the sea as long as I'm above the surface. Story 6. A friend of mine and his mate got a job to sail a yacht from Rio to Cape Town. A while after they got back, I went drinking with my mate, and after we'd had a few, he says something weird happened to him on the boat. It was around sunset, and he looked up to see a man in a suit standing near him. The man tells him to come, and the next thing he remembers, he's floating in the fetal position down metallic corridors. He seemed to almost go into a trance, describing looking into the bays as he was floating past, and seeing people creatures being examined, experimented on. Next thing he remembers, he's back on the boat, and it's just after sunset. Cool story, bro. A month or so later, I bump into his friend in another bar, and again, after getting pretty hammered, this guy starts telling the same story. I'm like, nah, you guys came up with this bullcrap story between yourselves, to much confusion. So much so that we caught a cab to my mate's place and I sat and watched them piece the story together. I'm pretty sure they didn't concoct the story. Story 7. I woke up to take a piss. Head was occupied, went to the stern. The entire sea behind the boat was glowing blue. My piss stream made these beautiful colors of aquamarine and violet. Thought I was hallucinating or dreaming and went back to bed. I stayed awake petrified. I had died and was in some sort of alternate reality or something. Told no one for years. Found a video online. Apparently, it's a type of bioluminescent algae. It ducked with me for far longer than it should. Story 8. I'm not sure this is exactly what you're looking for, but I spent several years as a mechanic on an aircraft carrier. Every single one of us in my division had stories like this. I was on watch in the propulsion plant while we were in port, so I was the only one in there. I saw a sailor I didn't recognize rounding a corner, so I hurried over to challenge him. Most people on the ship weren't authorized to be down there. When I got around the corner, there was nobody there. Another time I saw a large, heavy, bolted down water tank move itself a foot or so. I sat down on the deck and just stared at it for like 20 minutes until I came to my senses. Despite being legitimately spooked by this stuff, we pretty much all agreed that we were hallucinating due to exhaustion and compounding fatigue. Not that the plant was haunted or anything, but who knows, maybe it was. Story 9. Not sure if it's considered creepy, but kinda unnerving. I was active duty Navy for 4 years based on a destroyer out of Japan. I'd say I'd seen it all, but this story really stuck with me. We were putting around when we get a distress call from a cargo ship about 100 miles or so away. It wasn't them in distress, but another boat, and they were relaying it out to get some help. We responded, met up with the cargo ship en route. There was something cool about that, a US Navy warship meeting up a cargo vessel from like Australia or some crap to rescue some Thai fishermen. By the time we got on scene, another ship was there and was doing circles looking for the crew. We found the fishing vessel about 90 feet submerged underwater. Only the bow was still above the water. Unfortunately, we were not able to find any crew members. We found a few empty floating devices, but no crew. We stayed on scene looking around for a few hours, even sending out our choppers. Ultimately, we had to call it as we had another prior mission to take care of. We left the cargo ship and other ship to look, but really, I don't think either of them found anything. To this day, I'm not sure what caused that fishing boat to sink. And it's sad to see the boat, but no crew. Story 10. Not a sailor, and I wasn't on the ocean, but on a cliff overlooking the water. It was California, and I was traveling with my family for a road trip, so we decided to stop and see the views. The parking area was blocked off from the view by trees, and we had to take a trail to see the views. My brother and I, aged 19 and 15, decided that we would run all of the way there. But my brother is faster than me, so I lost sight of him on this extremely steep downward slope. I came to a fork in the trail, but I didn't know which was. He went, and I didn't receive an answer when I called his name. I went right and followed the trail all the way down to a cliff at least 50 meters above the water, still calling his name, and still he didn't respond. Looking down, there were jagged rocks in the water below, so falling was a guaranteed death sentence. The wind picked up, and I had to actually press myself against the rocks to stop it from pushing me over the edge. It continued to get faster and faster, but then suddenly stopped. I don't know how, but the air went completely still, and I heard a faint voice of a little girl screaming like she was terrified of something. There was nobody else around me, and there was no other voice that I heard, so I started calling for the little girl. She very clearly started calling out, "Mama, Mama, I'm scared." And I followed her voice to this slightly jutting shelf that started to lead down the cliff. The rocks were covered in sand and were slightly damp, so I knew it was dangerous. But I continued on anyway. Maybe only 6 meters down, there was a sharp 90-degree turn against the cliff that I couldn't see around. But my instincts were telling me to get back. I slowed but still inched my way to this turn, and looking over was a perfectly vertical drop into the ocean below. If I took even one more normal-sized step, my foot would have stepped right over. I still looked around to see if there really was a little girl somewhere, but there was nowhere she could have hidden, so I went back up. I could still hear her voice, and it sounded so close to me, but I couldn't see her. My brother eventually caught up with me, since he went down the left trail, and the voice stopped. Upon asking him if he saw anyone or heard the voice, he just shook his head. Creepiest experience I ever had with the Ocean Story 11. We had a noise shine down on us, my second time out. We were smoking, and our bridge also saw, heard, confirmed it. It was a pretty bright, starry night, but this one area was a little brighter and had this dull, washed-out shaft appearance to it, and a lot like seeing the Milky Way overhead in the sky. We passed right by it, and there was a cyclical sound like wee-wah, somewhere between a humming and a sort of siren. It wasn't loud, almost more of a frequency, about 3 or 4 miles wide maybe, coming down not quite vertically. We could see it every time we checked for over an hour behind us. Then we checked, and it was totally gone. I wasn't horrified or anything, but the creepy part was how quiet everyone was. We all just kind of looked at each other and cracked a few nervous jokes. Not as juicy as seeing the Flying Dutchman or something like that, but I still think about it every time I see the night sky. Scariest thing? No doubt the 40, 50, 60 foot crests and being at a 45-degree angle for like 10 seconds at a time. Story 12. Not a sailor, but I jumped off the back of a boat when I was a teenager a few miles out to sea just to see what it was like. You jump in, and then every direction you look other than up just fades into a bottomless, seeming empty black abyss. Never in my life had I really felt so vulnerable and at the complete mercy of my current surrounding. Creepy, surreal, I would absolutely recommend doing at least once. Story 13. Not creepy, but odd. I was out fishing in the Gulf of Mexico off Sarasota with my best friend in a 21 center console. In the summer, there can be multiple small thunderstorms around you, but you can navigate in between them. One time a rainbow developed, and the edge of the misty rain was right on our boat. We were literally in the end of the rainbow. Prismatic colors all around us. You could look up and see the rainbow going up from there. It was one of the coolest things I've ever experienced. Story 14. The lesson remains. Never give your child any toys you find in the sea, especially dolls. Never pick a doll from the net and take it home. That's a cursed doll, that one is. Don't find a ball and take it home to your boy. That's a cursed ball, that one is. Leave the toys you find them, and you won't pull spirits from their watery graves. That's the lesson. That's the rule. Story 15. A few years ago, one of my buddies lost his life on the flight deck. His body wasn't flown off until a few days after the indecent. I still feel creepy to walk around the ship at night, like I'll see his ghost or something. Story 16. Was conscripted as a police officer and subsequently a police Coast Guard officer for my national service. Saw all kinds of creepy crap while out on patrol. Once we had to respond to a case where a woman tried to unalive herself. We managed to save the woman. It was a gruesome retrieval and thoroughly disheartening. Another incident that stuck with me was having to watch a subject I was administering CPR to die in front of me as we rushed him back to the jetty. I still remember how it felt when I vomited in my mouth. All the officers definitely had a supernatural experience of some kind aboard those patrol vessels. Sometimes it would be 2 or 3 in the morning, and we'd be up in the wheelhouse and swear we saw someone walk right across our bow. One time, I was taking a quick power nap down in the galley with another officer laying across the room from me. When I went to put my boots back on, I tapped his shoulder to tell him I was on my way back up to the wheelhouse. But when I got back up to the wheelhouse, everyone was already there. This was on a tiny 18-meter craft, mind you. So there's no way anyone could have slipped by me unnoticed. Incidents like these were barely unnerving, though. What really made me crap my pants were night patrols in crafty sea states through rocky waters, within spitting distance of massive merchant vessels who probably could barely see us, save for their radar ops and our transponder. The sound of the waves striking almost the base of our hull like a bell as our tiny vessel rocked from port to starboard always made me feel like we would never see the end of oar shift, and all this at 18 years old. Woohoo. Story 17. I don't know if I count as a sailor, but I used to do voluntary sea rescue as a kid. We were having an exercise where they dropped 6 of us to the middle of the sea in a small rescue raft. We didn't have enough room to sit comfortably. The objective was to stay there for the night and radio the station every 30 minutes as a test how well we can estimate the passage of time. Well, we were sitting in the raft about 4 hours in when we all just heard the creepiest sound ever, like a wandering soul screaming. I instantly popped out of the tent-shaped raft to check if the others were pulling a prank on us, but I saw nobody. And I remind you, this happened on empty seas with the closest island a kilometer away, so I would have noticed any pranksters. Story 18. I'm not a sailor, but my dad was in the Navy for 30 years. He enlisted in 1944. He told me a story that's always fascinated me. He said they had been tracking a German submarine when suddenly the sub breached the water. He said they immediately surrendered. When the men got on board their ship, they were all old, way past the age of an enlisted man. They told them their ages, and they ranged from 18 to 43, but these men were obviously elderly. Dad said some of the men died that night. The doctor aboard said they died from old age natural causes. He said they were put in the bunks and kept there until they were transferred to a carrier. Dad said they weren't told anything about the men or what happened to them. In 1984, I went to Navy reunion with him in San Francisco. After all the introductions and a few drinks, one of his shipmates says, "Well, who wants to know what happened to those men?" Then says they were given experimental substances that were supposed to open up areas of our dormant brain. That in fact it worked, but rapidly increased aging. He said they all died within a week and the oldest was 43. Crazy stuff. Story 19. A white squall approaching on radar, under a cloudless, star-filled sky. First it was just a skinny green line on the scope, but slowly crept across the whole screen, headed my way. It was pitch black outside, and the wheelhouse lights were on, so every time I peeked my head out over the rail, I saw absolutely nothing. Thinking it was some sort of glitch in the radar, I just kept steaming along, hoping it would just go away. Boom! 10 to 15 foot seas, 40-50 mph winds, and pelting horizontal rain. Every single thing on the boat that wasn't tied down ended up on the deck and in the bottom of the cuddy. Crap flying around everywhere, and water pouring over the gunnels. I thought for sure we were going down, but after what seemed like an hour but was only like 15 minutes, it was over as quick as it started. Skipper and me both needed stitches, and another deckhand suffered a broken arm. We limped back to the harbor, bailing out as best we could, and spent the next 3 days putting the boat back together. I only sailed for 3 seasons, but I've got a lifetime of memories. Story 20. Was sailing on a tall ship in the open sea. Good breeze, so making 12 plus knots, and heeled over so hard that over the rail, you were almost looking straight into the water. Out of nowhere, a dark gray shape, maybe 20 feet long, pulls right up alongside us. Just paces us for 1-2 min, right over that starboard rail and keeping up like it's nothing. Then it rolls over, and we see a bright white belly before it disappears under the waves. To this day, I have no idea what it was. Story 21. Not my story, but a bit of maritime lore that was told to me when I was a young boy. Anyways, as the story goes, in the 1700s in the dead of winter off the coast of North Carolina, there was a merchant ship trying to find safety from a winter ice storm bearing down upon them. But thanks to the condition of the storm, they couldn't find a port or cove to shelter in, so they had no choice but to weather out the storm. And so they climbed the rigging and tied themselves into it so they wouldn't get tossed by the gnarly bucking waves or the icy gales. And they didn't dare go below deck in the event of the ship capsizing or sinking. A few days went by and the ship didn't show up, so people walked the shores of the Outer Banks looking for them, only to find the ship run up on the shore with over a dozen men still standing in the rigging. The search team called out, but they received no response, so they climbed aboard the grounded ship, only to find the men still standing frozen solid, hanging onto the rigging of that ship in a way only the dead can. Now, don't quote me on the validity of my retelling, because it's been a long time since I've heard the story, and it's sure to have changed over the years from the original event. Story 22. My father used to work on boats occasionally as a safety officer for the Navy, but never when they were actually at sea. He'd make sure all the correct procedures were being followed, deliver training sessions, etc. One day, he was finished giving a seminar in the canteen, and when everyone else had left, an old man tapped him on the shoulder and asked what he was doing there. My father told him, and the old guy looked upset and stormed off, muttering to himself. My father, naturally, was left baffled, having never seen the man before. He asked people back at the base who the guy was and why he was so pissed off, but no one had a clue who he was talking about. You needed pretty serious security clearance to get on board, so it should have been impossible for a civilian to embark. To this day, he still has no clue what happened, but he was pretty spooked for the next few days. Story 23. Leaving the harbor in a tiny base scallop boat, not much bigger than a dinghy, and losing a sense of direction after going through a wall of what we call pea soup, fog so dense you can't see more than a few feet in any direction. It's like going into a different dimension, and a novice could easily be lost at sea when they had no intention of ever going more than a quarter mile off the coastline. One shift of the wind and you might think you're going back to land when you are in fact going further away and running out of gas. Racing back to harbor for safety through a heavy lightning storm with bolts touching down on the water all around the boat, close enough to kill you if you were in the water, and the captain letting go of the metal steering wheel in fear of getting zapped. Slipping your foot out of a rope coil the very second that it zips off the back of the boat with a chain of lobster pots that go out with so much force and weight. If you didn't get your foot out right before the slack was tightened, you would be at the bottom of the ocean, dead the very next moment. Just a statistic. Another young fisherman gone too soon. There is no stopping it once it happened. The captain then has to haul up his dead mate and bring him home to his family. Story 24. Leading seaman here. Nothing scarier than doing a round, walking around exterior decks, checking rooms for fires and such. When the ship is underway at night, so it's pitch black and only a red flashlight for light, and the ship's engines are very loud, I always get the sense there's something following you in the dark. If you fell in, no one would know for at least 20 minutes or much more. Story 25. Not me that this happened to, but a girl I dated's cousin. 2 years ago, my ex's cousin and her friend stole one of these mini sailboats in the middle of the night from the college nearby and rowed it out to this lighthouse, about a mile or so out in Long Island Sound, called New London Ledge Lighthouse. When they finally got out to the lighthouse, she had the guy she was with take a quick video and a picture of her on Snapchat. Not too long after that, she apparently tried calling her mom, but her mom was sleeping and missed the call and didn't see it until the next day after neither of them came home. I'm not sure how many days it had been exactly, but I think about a week later someone found the guy's body floating in Long Island Sound, but to this day, haven't found the girl's body. The only evidence they really have from the night is the picture she posted on Snapchat of her standing on the boat next to the dock on the lighthouse, and the phone call she made to her mom, but there was no voicemail left, so no one knows if she might have been trying to call someone for help. Story 26. I have crossed every ocean and sailed many seas, large and small vessels of all types, and nothing really creepy out there. Crafty storms, yes, but most of the time I just enjoyed watching the stars, seeing fireballs in the sky. I was lucky to have gone through the Strait of Magellan with clear skies. What a beautiful area. Just keep enjoying those surroundings and notice how small you really are. Story 27. I was a fisherman all over the Bering Sea for 12 years. I always saw some strange things, but there's one beautiful instance that always stuck with me. I was on a mid-sized boat with probably 20 other guys. I was watching the helm that night when the strangest thing happened. I started to doze off. I've always been great at staying awake, but that day was different. I must have been asleep for hours. When I woke, all the instruments weren't working. We probably drifted at least a few miles north. This was a newer boat, and stuff like this doesn't usually happen. I looked out and I saw the northern lights. It was something I've seen a few times before, but it was never that vibrant. I just sat there in awe. We eventually made it back on course, and we all made it home safe. Except I don't know where I went. It must have been somewhere way farther north. I'm retired, but I still want to go back to wherever that place was. That was the only time in my life I ever felt truly at peace. Story 28 was on watch in an armory late at night. When I heard a large boom and they called engineering teams away, I sent my kids out to make sure none of our ordnance was to blame. Turns out it was a tsunami heading towards Sea Asia, and I went from thinking the deployment might be shortened to great, we are getting extended. Story 29. Dolphins, probably. I don't even have a full year of experience, so nothing crazy. Seeing a dolphin wouldn't normally be creepy. We were motoring in a Lil Zodiac on the Pacific Ocean. Early morning, foggy, everything's still and quiet. The water's so dark that you really can't see anything unless it's basically on the surface. Imagine the way my throat tried to jump out my mouth when I looked down from where I was weighing down the front and saw something looking back at me. They like to play in the wake. I got splashed a second later. My friend and I screamed like idiots the whole time because we were still half asleep, and they moved on a minute later. Story 30. Nighttime on USS Ronald Reagan. I was on the flight deck and my supervisor and I see a bright light under the water. It's off the starboard side and keeping pace with us. Bunch of people saw it. No one knew what it was. We were near North Korean waters at the time because they had recently launched missiles over Japan. I wonder if it was a Chinese sub or surveillance vessel letting us know they see us. Story 31. A mild one, but I was sailing a race at sea in Belgium, Ostend, and had capsized, so was dead last. And right before the finish, the water was crowded with roses, hundreds of flowers just floating there. Because I was last and the direction of the tide, I was the first to see it, and it was very confusing. That same race, I thought I saw a log up ahead, got closer and it moved, then realized it was a seal. I was about 2/3 meters away at that point in my little laser. Absolutely insane experience. Story 32. Creepy at the time, but later processed as somewhat normal. I was on duty at an elevator at night during Desert Storm. Took a minute to look out and saw a white flash in the ocean. Suddenly, a ballistic missile fired as it rose from the sea, presumably from a submarine. Scared the living crap out of me. Also had SEALs sneak aboard during a training exercise. Story 33. Quarterdeck in port, required ID to board the ship. Everyone. Captain, exec officer, no exceptions. Happened to be around and was amused when I saw the ship's bosun going up to the quarterdeck with his usual morning mug of whiskey and coffee, so I stopped to watch. His nickname on the low was Skeletor, and the ship's bosun is god of everything on the deck of the ship. Nobody had ever seen him smile or even grin, just the scowl. I'll never forget that look when they tried to eat him. He paused as if considering throwing the bosun's mate of the watch into the ocean, then kept walking. Exception to every rule.